It's always nice when your favourite decks either constantly get new support or are well designed enough to see play for many years past their initial shelf life. Many people put a lot of themselves into certain decks, and the ability to keep playing them years later and still be at least somewhat competitive is a good way to ensure that those players stick around for a long time. Happened with Burning Abyss, Monarchs, Cyber Dragons, and here with one of my favourite decks, Gravekeepers. An absolute terror in GOAT format, as I've already covered on this channel, Gravekeepers lay dormant for several years afterwards as the game became too fast for them to keep up at anything more than a rogue level. However, in 2010 we got the set Absolute Power Force, and with it a bunch of powerful new support that once again brought the Keepers back from the grave and to the top tables once more, with Gravekeeper Burn taking a top 16 spot at SCG Edison and has been a raw contender in the meta ever since. Now the deck isn't as powerful as it was in GOAT format due to years of power creep, however with its powerful beaters and floodgates, it's still more than capable of putting up a decent result. So let's take a look at it, shall we? Let's start off with the old GOAT Gravekeeper gang here, as despite 5 years passing we still run the likes of Gravekeepers Spy, Assailant and Guard in this deck. Now Gravekeepers Spy was the key piece of the deck back in GOAT, and that's still very much the case here, as in addition to having a 2k body by itself and a 2-5k defense under Necro Valley, Spy upon being flip summoned can search any other Gravekeeper from the deck and summon it to the field. Now like in GOAT format, Spy can search another copy of itself or Guard to pump up our defense, Assailant to go on the offensive, and now thanks to a new card printed for this deck, we also have access to a solid removal option, something this deck definitely needed to compete with the faster paced Edison format decks, making Spy arguably more valuable in this deck than she ever has been in the past. Next up we have Gravekeepers Guard, who when flipped allows us to bounce a monster back to the opponent's hand. Now like I said back in the GOAT guide, this card can give us a massive tempo advantage when bouncing back a card that requires a cost to play it, like a tribute monster for example, as not only does your opponent have to replay the bounced card, but also re-establish the conditions to resummon it. And with most decks in this format playing synchros, this effect is more powerful than ever. Say for example you use this to bounce a Stardust Dragon. Now not only does your opponent have to get Stardust Dragon back on the field, he also needs to get back a tuner and a non-tuner to do so, which puts them very low on resources compared to us. For his great removal and humongous tempo swing, I'd argue that, like Spy, Guard is one of the most powerful Gravekeepers in Edison format, and could possibly be even more powerful than he was in GOAT. Finally, with the trio of GOAT holdovers, we have Gravekeepers Assailant, a 1500 attack monster that if it attacks when Necro Valley is up, can change the position of one monster on the field. Honestly, this is the one effect of the GOAT format cards that hasn't improved with age, as many monsters like Stardust Dragon and Black Rose have high attack and defense. However, it is worth noting this could help run over a few big monsters at the time, like again Monarch monsters and Dark Armed Dragon, both of which have 1000 defense. So still a good effect, just not as good as it was in GOAT format. So these three monsters survived the test of time and still saw a vital part of the Edison version of Gravekeepers. However, like I said earlier, this deck was essentially dead for several years prior to Edison format, even with these powerful monsters and great field spell. So what changed? Well, two powerful new additions to the deck's monster lineup, that's what. First up we have Gravekeepers Commandant from Force of the Breaker, a card from the cycle from that set that allowed certain archetypes to discard said card to add the archetype's field spell from deck to hand, essentially giving Harpies, Water decks, Heroes and in this case Gravekeepers 3 extra copies of their field spell. Now since Terraforming is at 1 currently in the TCG, I don't think I have to explain why this card is so good. But what makes it even better is that if one already has Necro Valley in play, Commandant is a 2100 attack level 4, making him the biggest monster in the deck and a rival to Cyber Dragon when it comes to normal summonable beaters. So yeah, we definitely run 3 of them in this deck. Now Commandant is good, but our final Gravekeeper is even better and was the key ingredient in bringing the Keepers back to prominence. May I introduce Gravekeepers Descendant. Another normal summon for the deck, Descendant gave Gravekeepers the one thing they lacked for so many years, and that was archetypal interaction, as by sacrificing any other keeper, Descendant can pop one card on the field, and a fact I'd like to add is not once per turn. What this does is essentially allow Gravekeepers a second way to control the field if they are overwhelmed before locking it down with their floodgates, as anything but a Stardust Dragon will fall to this card, so even if a deck does have a fast start, we can somehow come back with this card. Now granted, Necro Valley locking us out of our graveyard on paper, it could make it difficult to keep this effect fueled, as traditional revival and recursion effects won't work here, but thanks to another card printed in Power Force we'll talk about in a bit, we have that covered as well. throw in Sangan to search most of our monsters, and a morphing jar to refill our hand, and we have a very formidable monster lineup in this deck. Moving on to the spells, let's begin with the start of this deck, Necro Valley. Now, which version of this often written card do we have today? Well sir, this Necro Valley will grant all your Gravekeepers a 500 point buff, prevents any card in either grave from being removed from play, and prevents any targeting of any card in the graveyard. Now this does make this card a lot more powerful than it was in Gold format, and is part of the reason for the deck's resurgence. However, I would like to point out, it isn't the blanket graveyard shutdown it first appears, as non-targeting graveyard effects, heavily played in Edison like Rekindling and Value, can still be used under this card. That being said, this card still makes our keepers into decent walls and beaters, and locks out cards like Dark Armed Dragon, Mizuki, etc., and also enables several other powerful cards in this deck. So yes, this card is still the heart and soul of the Gravekeeper strategy. Speaking of powerful cards that Necro Valley enables, we have one of the most bonkers cards ever designed for an archetype next, in Royal Tribute. A card that when Valley is active, forces both players to discard every monster in their hand to the graveyard. Yeah, that's pretty nuts. Now again, I think the power of this card is fairly self-evident. However, I just want to point out that how, if you're in the lead with this deck and activate this card, you're almost guaranteed to win, because not only have you potentially stripped your opponent of any way to summon, you've also, because of Necro Valley, made it almost impossible for them to make a comeback with those resources. Now granted, this card is terrible on the back foot and an awful top deck, but the blowout games this card generates are more than justify playing this beast of a card. Speaking of powerful Gravekeepers cards, we have another one from the time with Gravekeepers Steel, a normal spell that bypasses the effects of Necro Valley and allows us to revive 2 Gravekeepers from the grave back to our hand. Now, Gravekeepers have always been good at aggro plans, locking the opponent out of useful effects and floodgating the opponent to death. However, the one thing they've always struggled with is making a comeback due to their own field spell preventing them from using cards in their graveyard, meaning in Gold format cards like Premature Burial and Call of the Haunted were basically unusable in the deck. Steel fixes this massive hole in Gravekeeper strategy by allowing them to reuse cards like Spy to search several play enablers and Descendant to pop more cards, and also refuels Descendant's effects with extra Gravekeeper bullets to continue firing at our opponent, making these two cards a monster destruction engine capable of wiping many cards from the field in a few short turns. Outside of playing removal like Smashing Ground and MST, the one other notable spell that carried over to this deck from GOAT format is of course Book of Moon. A quick play spell, Book allows us to flip any monster face down. Now just like in GOAT format, we can use this card on our own monsters to reuse the effects of Spy and Guard, essentially giving us 3 more searches and bounce effects. However, we can also use this card to disrupt our opponent in many different ways, from blanking their attacks to flipping down monsters with low defense like Dark Armed Dragon to make them easy to run over. In addition to this, a new use for this card came in the synchro era, as it can be used to disrupt synchro summons themselves by flipping down either tuner monsters or non-tuners, leaving their levels unknown and the summon impossible for the turn. Wow, non-destruction interaction really got a lot better in the synchro age, didn't it? Finally, moving on to the trap cards, a key aspect of the deck in GOAT format, and we see the deck still relies heavily on them to be successful here. Only this time we are leaning heavier on more floodgates than just Necro Valley. Yeah, sorry everyone, but when a deck is this long in the tooth, it often needs this kind of help. First up we have Skill Drain, which for the cost of 1000 life points negates the effects of all monsters on the field. Now yes, this will turn off Spy searching and Descendant's removal effects. However, with Necro Valley giving a boost to the majority of our monsters, they are still likely to win in a Caveman Yu-Gi-Oh scenario, as long as we keep our opponent's extra deck monsters at bay, and make them fight us main deck to main deck, as very few Edison main decks can beat a 2000 attack Gravekeeper, which brings us to our next floodgate for that purpose, Royal Oppression. A staple of many decks of the format, Royal Oppression allows both players to pay 800 life points to negate any special summon, and this effect is not a once per turn, meaning that in most scenarios this card is a more powerful Vanity's Emptiness, a card that is already one of the strongest floodgates in Yu-Gi-Oh history. Now, as I mentioned in my Black Wings guide last time, this card isn't a foolproof way to lock down the field from all special summons, but 9% of the time this card will prevent all summons from the opponent's extra deck and make it much slower for decks with main deck big monsters like dragons to deploy their threats, which puts a deck like Gravekeepers with mostly normal summonable monsters that plays at a slower pace in an excellent position to take over the game. Now, being a deck that both runs a powerful field spell and several powerful floodgates, we need ways to protect our back row, because to be honest, this deck kinda needs it and dies if it doesn't have any way to lock down the field. So because of this, our next trap, and the only reason we have an extra deck, is Starlight Road. A normal trap, this card activates whenever 2 or more cards will be destroyed and negates that effect. Now by itself that would be a very powerful effect and worthy of inclusion in this deck. However, it gets even better, as this card also special summons a Stardust Dragon from our extra deck, which gives our entire board protection from removal and gives us a big body on board to contest with an opponent who has a very fast start and gets a big extra monster on field before we can lock them down. Between ripping a ton of cards from the opponent's hand, floodgating the field and locking out most graveyard interaction, it's safe to say our opponent will have a very hard time establishing any kind of true field presence against this deck. However, what if we don't draw enough lockdown pieces, or what if our opponent gets off to a very fast start with a deck like Blackwings and drops some massive monsters from the main deck or powerful synchros on us quickly before we can lock down the field? Well, my friend, that's what the rest of our traps are for. First up, we have a classic in Bottomless Trap Hole, a normal trap that when flipped on a monster with 600 or more attack, destroys that monster and then banishes it. Now, a deck like this that specialises in fairly weak monsters, it's important to have effects like this that deal with big threats like Dark Armed Dragon and Stardust, because even if we go and establish a lock on the board with the likes of Necro Valley and Skill Drain, it won't matter much if our opponent drops a big monster or two that we can't run over and they just pick us apart under our floodgates. In addition to this, the fact that this card banishes is also vitally important in dealing with decks that focus on graveyards and are fast, such as zombies, as we don't always have time to Necro Valley lock them early, so we need more ways to cut off their graveyards to prevent them from gaining a ton of resources early. In a similar vein to Bottomless, we also run Dimensional Prison, a battle trap that banishes an opponent's attacking monster. One of the clearest examples of direct power creep in Yu-Gi-Oh! History, Prison essentially fills the same role here as cards like Ring of Destruction and most notably Sakuretsu Armor did in the GOAT format version of this deck, in that it removes a powerful attacking monster that we either can't beat over or is going to deliver a lethal blow to us. The only difference being that it removes the monster from play instead of sending it to the graveyard, which like Bottomless makes it a good disruption tool against dart decks, zombie decks and other fast-paced graveyard decks that we can't Necro Valley quick enough. And our final card returning from GOAT format Gravekeepers, we have Solemn Judgment, a counter trap that for the cost of half your life points negates any card your opponent activates. Now, everything I said in my GOAT guide is still true about this card. Keepers is still aggressive enough, the life point cost doesn't really matter, as you'll likely win or lose quick enough regardless of it. However, in Edison, I'd argue that philosophy is true no matter what kind of deck you're playing, whether it's aggro or not. After the game sped up massively in late 2008, there really was no reason to hold on to your life points instead of playing powerful cards like Judgment, as the game would likely be over in a few turns anyway due to the powerful boards most decks with synchro monsters could now make. So because of this, I would say Judgment is a mandatory card in almost every single deck in Edison. In conclusion, despite the new support, Gravekeeper is nowhere near as strong in Edison format as it was in GOAT, or would be again a little after Edison when a bunch of new support was released. However, that still doesn't mean that it can be an excellent anti-meta deck in Edison with its own searchable floodgates and powerful back row, and isn't worth checking out, especially for GOAT players looking to get into the format. It's aggressive, can be oppressive, and it's always the underdog, but never fully out. In short, it's what Gravekeepers have always been. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you all next time.